Good evening, and welcome to the International Intelligence Briefing. I'm Hal Lindsey. The old year is history, and what an historic year it was. During the 20th century, the turn of the new year used to be a joyous time. But that all changed with the millennial New Year fear of terrorist attacks. Seattle even canceled its celebration that year. 2001 began in a state of heightened alert, witnessed the worst attack on American soil in history, and ended with bloodshed. 2002 will begin with bloodshed. There seems to be a pattern of downward progression developing. Instead of a traditional New Year's message, we will instead take a closer look at what drives those who want to kill us. To begin with, you need a decoder ring to sort through all of the conflicting statements emanating both from the government and from the media. For example, our government continues to insist that we're not at war with Islam. Saddam Hussein recently called for an emergency meeting of Arab leaders. He chose Mecca, Islam's holiest city, for the War Council meeting. He asked for the meeting to take place at the Kaaba, Islam's holiest shrine. Our government says that the terrorists hijacked Islam, which is really a religion of love. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. It currently holds more than a dozen people in prison for being Christians. They were not arrested for distributing literature or preaching to Muslims, but just for being Christians. The U.S. has asked for their release. The Saudis continue to hold them as criminals. These Christians aren't being held by Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, but by the Saudi Islamic government. If Saudi Arabia doesn't reflect pure Islam, then what does? All of our enemies have one thing in common: Islam. We're told that Islam was hijacked by fundamentalists. What does that mean? If the fundamentals of Islam are peace and love, why is the term Islamic fundamentalists a synonym for terrorists? Wouldn't an Islamic fundamentalist reflect the fundamentals of peace and love if that were truly what is at Islam's core? There will be those who will argue that even asking these questions exhibits a hateful, unchristian attitude. But I'm only asking the questions. You're supplying the answers. And the answers you're coming up with on your own are different from the doublespeak we're all getting used to. And now, by popular request, Myths of the Middle East, Dispelling the Lies. The first horrific assault in Jerusalem took place in a narrow walking mall on Ben Yehuda Street, only a block from the Sbarro Pizzeria, where 15 people were killed in August, including 7 children. 2 suicide bombers, each wearing bombs filled with nails, situated themselves about 30 yards apart on the narrow street. When they detonated their bombs, 10 boys between 14 and 20 years old were shredded. Another 175 people, mostly children, were wounded. To top off the barbarism, a car bomb was set off minutes later in an effort to kill or wound the rescuers racing to the scene. 12 hours later, a second powerful explosion ripped apart number 16 Egged bus in Haifa. This one killed 15 more Israelis. The blast was so powerful, it destroyed another bus that was following behind. Palestinians in refugee camps across Lebanon fired rifles into the air to celebrate the murders. Refugees in at least 6 camps across Lebanon celebrated in the streets. Hamas and Islamic Jihad raced one another to claim responsibility. Islamic Jihad initially took credit for the Jerusalem murders, but Hamas eventually claimed both Jerusalem and Haifa. The explosive power of both of these attacks indicate the use of a more powerful kind of explosive. President Bush immediately condemned the attacks but his comments were notable for what he did not say. In previous speeches, Bush has been careful to caution Israel to exercise restraint in its response. This time, he left that sentence out. The PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization, the main group on which the Palestinian National Authority was later founded, was listed as a terrorist organization until 1993. The signing of the Oslo Accords miraculously transformed the PLO's leader, Yasser Arafat, from terrorist to statesman. However, these latest outrages have officially turned the prince back into a frog. The government of Israel has declared Arafat's Palestinian Authority a terrorist-supporting entity all over again. The Israeli cabinet also said it considers Arafat's elite guard, Force 17, Fatah, and Tanzim, a Palestinian group loyal to Arafat's Fatah faction, to be terror organizations, and the activity against them will be in accordance. As a consequence of these declarations, the Minister for National Security will be able to make operative decisions regarding military, political, financial, and media matters as long as the Prime Minister, Defense Minister, and the Foreign Minister are included in the decisions. Israeli tanks moved into Gaza International Airport and bulldozed the runway. The Palestinian Air Force of 3 helicopters were destroyed on the ground. Yasser Arafat's headquarters were hit by Israeli air attacks. Israeli tanks moved into Palestinian-controlled cities, including Gaza City, Ramallah, Beit Lahia, and Nablus. Palestinian spin doctors are having a field day. Saeb Erekat attempted to build a base of international sympathy by calling the cabinet's statement a declaration of war. He called on the United States and the European Union to stop Sharon. But the spin wobbled when Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon himself called it a declaration of war. In a nationally televised address, the Prime Minister took a line from President Bush. "This war will not be an easy war. This war will not be a short war, but we shall win." In the U.S., PLO spokesman Hassam Abdel Rahman spun the terror bombings that killed 28 people in 12 hours. He followed the recipe that makes everything Israel's fault. He said it is unfair to put the blame on Yasser Arafat and the authority alone without looking at what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians. The conditions that are created by Israel make the Palestinian people very angry and very frustrated. In other words, Israel forced Hamas to target civilians. In the Jerusalem bombing, all 10 victims were teenagers, as were most of the wounded. President Bush went further than merely sympathizing with the Israelis. As a part of America's own war on terror, he ordered Hamas Front organization in the United States shut down and their assets seized. Among them was a registered Texas charity called the Holy Land Foundation. That group raised more than $13 million tax-free dollars last year. The money went directly to Hamas operations, including schools that start recruiting suicide bombers from the first grade up. The foundation also provided support for the families of suicide bombers. The group claimed that it was finding solutions for human suffering through humanitarian programs that impact the lives of disadvantaged, disinherited, and displaced peoples suffering from man-made and natural disasters. It further identified the area of focus as Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. You know, it's about time that something were done about all of these organizations that have been raising money, and there are many, especially in Southern California and in Texas. But they have tentacles all over the United States. And these with front names that sound so innocuous have been funneling money into the terrorist organizations in Palestine. I'm glad to see that the FBI and other organizations are doing thorough investigations. The U.S. Department of State maintains a catalog of terrorist groups on an official watch list. The largest of these are Abu Nidal, Abu Sayyaf, Armed Islamic Group, Al-Ghamas al-Islamiyah, Hamas, Harakat al-Mujahideen, Hezbollah, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, Al-Jihad, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, Palestine Islamic Jihad, Palestine Liberation Front, the PFLP, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Qaeda, and Pakistan's Army of Muhammad and Army of the Righteous. These groups have murdered thousands upon thousands in scores of nations in the name of Islam. Islamic apologists are quick to note that not all terror groups are Islamic. There are other groups on the list, like Spain's Basque or the IRA groups, but most of these are homegrown organizations. None of them come close to the Islamic terror network's level of indiscriminate murder on a global reach, and not one of them enjoys the state sponsorship of the Islamic groups. Abu Nidal, for example, has enjoyed safe haven, training, logistical support, and close support for selected operations from Libya, Iraq, and Syria. According to the State Department, Hezbollah gets its support from both Syria and Iran. State lists Saudi Arabia on its website as the principal source of support for Hamas. Iran supplies the money and Syria provides the material for the Palestine Islamic Jihad and for the PFLP. Iraq and Libya fund the Palestine Liberation Front, and all are connected in some way to the Al-Qaeda. You know, I've heard so much about, well, you know, the Islamic groups are just some terrorist groups among others. But I think this shows that they're distinct in many, many ways. For global outreach, for indiscriminate hitting of many nations, no other terrorist group in the world can compare to the network of Islamic terrorist groups. They're literally hitting areas all over the world. The White House says we're not at war against the Muslim religion, and we're not. We're at war with the terrorist groups and terrorist states who are Islamic. But that does not mean that Islam is not at war with the United States. The list of states with significant Islamic populations that are friendly to the United States is a very short one. So short, in fact, that we define what constitutes friendly by whether or not the states are Islamic. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are deemed friendly states, but if England or Canada or Mexico were to deal with Washington in the manner of Riyadh or the Kuwaitis, we wouldn't regard them as very friendly. When it comes to Islamic regimes, the fact we don't have direct evidence linking them to anti-American terror makes them friendly, even when we suspect them of being linked. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are our other new best friends. We're both active supporters of the Taliban until September the 11th. The State Department still ties the Saudis to both Hamas and Al-Qaeda, but through middlemen.